Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 276. This week the questions are taken from guides 342 and 343, that's the guides to the Hilfskreuzer Cormoran and USS Benson, and the Wednesday videos repairing a damaged warship and the April 2022 US tour of USS Wisconsin. So let's get on with questions. BK Zhong asks, there have been many discussions about ships that either survived ridiculous amounts of damage, Enterprise, Seydlitz, Shikaku, etc., or took extreme amounts of overkill to sink, Yamato, Musashi, Hornet, etc., or, in some cases, both, like Yorktown. However, what are some examples of ships that sank unusually easily compared to what one would reasonably have expected from the various major navies, discounting the cases of ships being incomplete like Shinano? There's quite a few different examples for various different causes, one of the most prominent of course being Ark Royal. There's a fairly decent chance she could have been saved if everyone had gone full damage control after the torpedo hit, which, as you can see, eventually did end up sinking her. But to be fair, at the same time, they would have had a bit more of an uphill struggle than with most aircraft carriers, thanks to a very long longitudinal, that's a fore to aft bulkhead, which really didn't help matters. So a mixture of mostly design flaws, but also a little bit of a bad call by her captain, meant that Ark Royal sank far more easily, after taking far less damage than other carriers comparable to her in size and displacement and time period. And then there's my favourite beating stick, the Indefatigable class, specifically Indefatigable herself at Jutland. And just for reference, people have asked me to explain in a little bit more detail just how bad that particular situation was. Indefatigable, as I've mentioned before, only had 4 inches of armour over her fore and aft turret magazines. And at the range that she was most likely at around the time that she was hit, whilst having 6-inch armour there like her predecessors, the Invincibles, would have been marginal as to whether or not it penetrated the belt, so the belt might have protected it, but it also might not, depending on the exact angle of impact and so on and so forth. But if the belt was penetrated, it would have been a relatively marginal penetration, i.e. it's relatively unlikely that the shell would have managed to make it down to her magazines and then explode down there. It would have exploded, slightly further out in the ship or arrived in small fragments, which would have meant that an Invincible taking the same kind of hit probably has a 70 to 80% chance of surviving. And Indefatigable didn't and just went pop. Another example, actually, from that same battle, Jutland, would be a possibly slightly controversial one, SMS Lutzow, the second of 3 Derflinger-class battle cruisers, and as those of you who've watched the channel for a while will know, her ultimate fate was mostly sealed by the fact that she took a 12-inch round from Invincible into her forward torpedo flat. And once that occurred, the amount of flooding that went into that one large chamber, combined with other more general damage, meant that she was pretty much doomed. So the rest of the damage that Lutzow had suffered was pretty par for the course for a ship that's gone into battle. But if you looked at all those other hits that she took, you wouldn't necessarily expect that to sink her, or really any ship of her approximate size and capabilities. But that one hit in that one weak spot, which could have been negated by a few relatively easy to make design changes, meant that for, as I said, an amount of damage that really shouldn't have put her down, even though she would have been heavily damaged, kind of like Seydlitz, she ended up going under. And of course, you can also add the Taiho to that list, because, given her size and level of protection, The hit that killed her really shouldn't, but thanks to some poor decisions with ventilation, it ended up being the start of a chain reaction that ultimately doomed her. The thing is, it's relatively easy to come up with a list of ships that sank fairly easily, but ships that sank fairly easily when they shouldn't is a slightly narrower margin of things, because you could point to, say, the Königsberg class, the great glory of being the only class of warship to lose a vessel to a skewer, of all things. But then when you look at them, they're really lightly built, really small light cruisers, so, that they sank that easily is not exactly a surprise, so they don't really belong in this particular category. The Mighty Nanto asks, given that it led directly to the fall of Singapore and to a lesser extent the defeat at the Battle of Java Sea, and that there was no positive follow-up, like the sinking of Bismarck after Denmark Strait, or even a small bright side like a Castor managing to torpedo Scharnhorst before being sunk, thus forcing them to return to port after sinking Glorious instead of continuing after 2 other convoys, would it be right to conclude that the loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse was the worst defeat ever suffered by the Royal Navy in World War II, if not in both World Wars? And what defeat in World War I even comes close to it? If you want to stick to strictly, if you like, military defeats, like capital ship or warship on warship, as opposed to something like PQ-17, which is a defeat for the Royal Navy, even if it's mostly merchant ships in a convoy. So sticking more to the naval as opposed to maritime side of things, yeah, you could probably make a pretty solid argument for Forced being the worst Royal Navy defeat of the Second World War. And I think that's because it combines a loss of prestige in the theatre with the loss of some very valuable ships, combined with the fact it's a pretty much near total defeat with, as you said, pretty much no upside coming out of that. Whereas if you look at, well, you mentioned the sinking of Hood by Bismarck. Bismarck at least got sunk afterwards. Various small ship engagements, obviously A, don't carry the prestige, and B, if you lose a destroyer or two or a cruiser or two here or there, that's nowhere near as valuable to you as a brand new fast battleship and an old but admittedly still very useful battle cruiser. And even extending into World War I, Coronel might be on the cards. It was a big hit to the Royal Navy's prestige so early in the war for them to lose a relatively large engagement. But, kind of like with Denmark Strait, von Spey's squadron was defeated shortly thereafter as a result, and with the best will in the world, poor old Craddock's squadron really didn't make a huge difference to the Royal Navy's order of battle, whether it was afloat or under the water, except for the loss of the men aboard. I would say the only reason I would hesitate to say Forced is the worst defeat in both World Wars is that in the First World War, I would actually put Beatty's run to the south slightly ahead. It cost more lives, it cost more ships, and strategically, you can blame a reasonable amount of the fact that Scheer was able to get away at the, obviously, follow-up part of the Battle of Jutland to the run to the south and Beatty's failures. Now, obviously, Scheer didn't get away entirely scot-free, and the British overall pulled a victory out of Jutland, and Scheer's own tactical brilliance and the weather obviously also have a significant part to play in that. But Beatty could have done a lot better. There's no real question that he lost that run to the south, so looked at as an isolated engagement, the run to the south is a British defeat. As I said, it cost more lives. And really, the overall strategic impact, especially in terms of what could have been, either way, if Forced had survived, what effects it could have had, versus what was missed because it was sunk, and similarly with the run to the south, the potential strategic impacts of the way that Beatty lost the run to the south actually go significantly beyond that for Force Z, because, okay, Force Z did caused some rather major problems. But at the end of the day, losing Singapore was a setback for the Royal Navy. ABDA Command being essentially wiped out and forced to fall back with its survivors was a setback for the Allies, but neither of those threatened to lose them the war, or indeed even come close. Whereas if you look at some of the rolls of the dice that fell one way or the other for the two engagements, Prince of Wales got a really bad roll, natural 1, when she got hit on the stern by that torpedo, combined with the idea of restarting that shaft. That was stupendously bad luck. And Beatty had some stupendously good luck, because it's entirely possible he could have lost at least 1, possibly 2 more battle cruisers if the rolls had gone slightly differently on the hits that they took. He might have gotten the Royal Navy's premier battle squadron of brand new sort of fast battleships wiped out. And if it wasn't for the efforts of Second Light Cruiser Squadron and some very clever deduction work by Jellicoe, the Grand Fleet could have been caught out of position as well. So, essentially Beatty set things up for a far, far, far larger failure than even foresaid did. He was just saved by the fact that some of the dice rolls went not even necessarily Beatty's way, but went the way for the Grand Fleet rather than against them, whereas with foresaid almost everything went against them. Vicky asks, why didn't various navies in the World Wars hire privateers to help raid enemy commerce? Given the success that German merchant raiders, which are almost the same thing, but they have naval rather than private crews, had on preying on Entente-Allied shipping, it would seem like hiring lots of privateers and turning them loose on oceanic shipping would be a highly cost-effective commerce warfare strategy, especially for Germany in both wars and potentially the US in World War II, at least against Japan. Whilst this would admittedly violate the Paris Declaration, which repudiated privateering, no one involved in either World War showed any significant compunction about disregarding various other previously agreed international laws to gain a tactical or strategic advantage. Partially, it was the Treaty of Paris, or Declaration of Paris, back in the 1850s, which outlawed privateering, which meant that a lot of the setup, the support infrastructure, and the idea of privateering, by the time you get 70-ish years later to World War I and considerably further on for World War II, it's kind of gone away, so there's not the backdrop to support that, whereas prior to that, there had usually been a war somewhere on the planet going on with some element of naval engagement at least every few years, going back centuries, and for a good chunk of that, those wars had involved major European powers with a lot of ships at sea, which meant that there was a whole infrastructure culture, if you will, almost, in some towns and cities on the coast that had grown up to support privateering. And without that, then it was not quite as easy to find privateers in the first place. Another element is increased cost combined with increased risk. Now, to get a ship to hand has never been a particularly easy or cheap endeavour. It was certainly a lot more affordable to fit out a small privateer back in the Age of Sail than it would have been to find a ship suitable for privateering in World War I and World War II. That, in turn, obviously vastly reduces the number of people who could even afford to be modern-day privateers, combined, again, with the fact that there's fewer ships out there. There's a lot of merchant ships out on the seas, but if you look at the number of merchant ships plying their trade in World War I and World War II compared to the number of merchant vessels around in the Age of Sail, they've gotten larger, but correspondingly there are somewhat less of them, which makes finding targets a bit more difficult. And all of that compounds with, as mentioned, the risk factors. If you were a Age of Sail privateer, bearing in mind these are commercial ventures, obviously looking to get a return on investment, if you sail around with your cannon and you run into an enemy vessel that is also armed, There's a reasonable chance that as a specially fitted out privateer, you will have a significantly greater armament than your opponent, so you'll probably win the gunfight in relatively short order. But even if you pick on a slightly more difficult target, you have got a reasonable chance of just breaking away, making your repairs and going off and doing something else. And those repairs aren't going to be spectacularly expensive unless you really, really stuff it up. However, guns have gotten a lot more destructive in the intervening time, especially with the use of high explosives in the shells, and merchant ships don't really have any armour, which means that any confrontation you do get into is much more likely to result in A, very expensive, and B, potentially fatal damage, in the worst case to you, but also quite potentially to the ship that you are targeting. And you just look at some of the armed merchant cruiser engagements in World War I to see just how quickly ships can tear each other apart when armed with high explosive artillery and not a lot of protection. Bearing in mind that at least one German Hilfskreuzer lost a fight to a Liberty ship. And fitting out a Hilfskreuzer with its very large crew, special modifications and rather extensive firepower would be even more expensive than taking a relatively swift steamer and strapping some surplus guns to it, which has the additional corollary of almost anyone in the age of privateering could, if they really wanted to, go up and find someone who would sell them some cannon, even if it was the Admiralty, whereas by the First and Second World Wars, governments were a lot more reticent about allowing long-range naval artillery to fall into the hands of civilians. Niels Larsen asks, can you go into detail about the designations of corvettes, frigates, sloops and destroyers? What are the differences between them, both in their design and mission profiles? So I recently did a Fun Friday on this, well, not on this specifically, but on ship designations in the age of steam and steel, which did cover these. So if you want it in a little bit more detail, I'd suggest going and having a look at that video. But in brief, if we look at when all four of these designations existed at the same time in World War II, then you essentially have the corvette, exemplified by something like the Flower class or the Castle class, is a anti-submarine warfare vessel. It's not particularly quick. It's based off of a merchant hull, and it will have a single propeller shaft. It's cheap, it's quick, it's easy, it's basically only going to do convoy escort. It has a relatively minimal self-defense capability against anything other than submarines. You know, it can maybe scare off the occasional patrol aircraft. That's probably about it. The frigate is a twin-screw anti-submarine escort. Again, primarily for convoy duties. It's going to be a little bit bigger, somewhat faster, and somewhat larger than the corvette. And although they may not be built to full military spec, they are usually far more towards the idea of being built to a military specification than a corvette, which, as I said, may very well be derived from a merchant hull and built to merchant standards. A sloop, on the other hand, is a general-purpose vessel which will have a certain amount of anti-submarine warfare capability, but will also be expected to do more general anti-surface radar work, obviously not against a large cruiser or a battle cruiser or battleship or something, but against armed merchant cruisers and the like. A sloop can put up a bit more of a fight. Unlike in the Second World War corvettes and frigates, sloops are pre-war vessels, although they are continued to be built during World War II as well, and as such they are built much more stringently to military specifications, but they are still limited in speed and firepower, primarily because most, not all, but most sloops were built under the, or at least designed, under the auspices of the various naval treaties which restricted ships of that particular size, i.e. the unregulated ones, in both displacement, speed, and, of course, firepower. whereas some frigates would end up considerably faster and more heavily armed than sloops because they are obviously built in the wartime period, although where frigate ends and small destroyer begins is sometimes a little bit debatable. And then finally you have the destroyer, and unlike the other three, which are all designed primarily as escorts of some description, for merchant shipping, destroyers are fleet units. They are what you might call the minimum viable warship, the sort of the equivalent of a 5th or 6th rate in Age of Sail terms. They are designed to serve with the battle fleet as well as potentially running escort operations of their own, and what they're escorting may be merchant shipping, it may be warships, it may be just themselves doing supply runs, but they are full-scale warships. Their primary function and primary design is for speed and armament, as opposed to other considerations for corvettes, frigates, and sloops, and they will be preferred to be used on the front lines as opposed to the corvettes, frigates, and sloops, which will usually take their place when there are enough of them. And destroyers obviously can operate as packs on their own, going after specific military objectives, like Warburton Lee's flotilla at the Second Battle of Narvik, or indeed the German destroyers at the First, Second, and Third Battles of Narvik, etc., etc. Joab asks, please excuse me if I'm missing something obvious, but why didn't destroyers have torpedo launchers built into the hull, similar to submarine tubes? Even if you didn't want to lose the deck-mounted ones, wouldn't being able to carry 4, maybe 8 or more that could be shot whilst presenting your narrowest profile have some value? On paper, it seems like a good idea, but there are some fairly major problems with it. Now, that's not to say it wasn't done entirely. If you look at some pictures of torpedo gunboats, which are sort of one half of the predecessor to the destroyer, a number of torpedo gunboats, including some that were built right up to the turn of the 20th century, do actually have a single forward-firing fixed torpedo tube in the bow. But generally speaking, torpedo boats and then torpedo boat destroyers, which torpedo gunboats kind of evolve into -R, and then destroyers themselves, tend not to have them. And the reasons are mostly to do with weather and water pressure. So if you have externally mounted forward torpedo tubes on the bow in fixed positions, given the speed that destroyers move at and their size, they're going to constantly be battered by water coming over the bow, which is probably going to render them inoperable just through, water infiltration and damage. And when you want to actually launch the things, like when you're approaching an enemy ship at high speed, that's probably about the worst time to try and launch them, because of course your destroyer moving at high speed is going to have a lot of water coming over there. So whether the firing circuits survive or whether anyone can actually physically get there to manually fire them is a little bit questionable. And then when you look at fixed into the bow, like a submarine's tubes would be, you've got to remember that submarine launches, generally speaking, occur at relatively low speeds compared to a destroyer, which might be going 30 plus knots. So if you try to open the bow doors to unleash your torpedo, well, the first thing that's going to happen is that a good majority of door designs at this time period probably won't open under the sheer force of the water that's coming past them, again with the destroyer going at speed. And even if you have a kind of sliding block door as opposed to an outwardly opening door as most torpedo tubes do, then your next problem is you're going to have water traveling at 30-35 knots, quite a few tons of it, slamming into the tube, which may damage the torpedo itself and certainly may cause some rather significant and distressing pressure spikes, which might burst open the back end of the launcher, which is going to be a rather major problem. And so firing torpedoes from a fixed forward-facing tube built into the hull of a destroyer really doesn't look like it's going to be viable at any great speed. And if you were going to fire torpedoes at a significantly slower speed, then you might as well use your deck launchers. There's a few other problems, like the fact that there's not a huge amount of space in a destroyer's bow. It's very, very pointed, as opposed to a submarine pressure hull, which, if you look at the pressure hull itself, is usually pretty much uniform width almost until the very, very, very front. So there's the space of where you'd put them is another problem. And, of course, the fact that if your destroyer is moving at 30, 35, 40 knots, your torpedo may, especially in the early days, may actually be slower than your destroyer, and certainly when you initially launch it, it's going to take some time to get up to speed. It might not be a lot of time, but during that time when your destroyer is moving faster than your torpedo, you may well run over your own torpedo. And so deck launchers, which can launch the torpedoes either completely off to the side, or if you're really dedicated to getting a torpedo in the direction that you're pointing, some of the earlier subs do have a kind of semi-fixed or possibly even completely fixed deck launcher that's angled out slightly, are your best bets, i.e. that take the torpedo offline. And when you look at some of the interwar torpedo-equipped destroyer designs, you get to the point where torpedoes can be programmed to turn once they've been launched, with varying degrees of success. But that's one of the ideas behind a lot of the interwar US destroyer designs that have lots of torpedo launchers mounted on either side, like the Wicks and Clemson's class starting off, i.e. you would fire your torpedoes from your deck launchers pointing somewhat ahead but not completely, and then they would turn and move straight ahead as if you had fired them from forward-mounted tubes, without all the problems we just listed for forward-mounted tubes. The Huskarl asks, did ships in the World War I-World War II timeframe have generators to produce electricity independent of the boilers? What systems had the highest priority for power if the ship was forced to run on such emergency power? Yes, they did to varying degrees. Generators, whether petrol or diesel powered, were being introduced into ships in World War I and would continue to be introduced and designed into vessels and refitted into vessels as time went on. So not every vessel in the First World War could produce electricity independent of their main power plant, but by World War II, pretty much everybody could. However, the amount of electricity that these generators could produce varied quite considerably compared to the amount of load that could be generated with the main power plant. And so, whilst the generators could, and obviously did, provide power for certain systems, at times even when part of the power plant or all of the power plant was shut down, you couldn't run the entire ship off of them. In fact, if you look at the Battleship New Jersey channel, they recently released a video where Ryan is actually talking about whether the ship will have power as she goes into dry dock, and he goes through the generating load capabilities in overall terms of an Iowa-class battleship, and what they might be able to do if, in theory, they were able to somehow get the ship's entire diesel generator battery running. And spoiler alert, you can't power an entire Iowa-class battleship purely off of its generators. You would need its main power plant going in to some degree, and they can't do that. In the event of partial or complete main power plant failure, what a ship would prioritize for electrical power greatly depended on the situation the ship was in. So if, for example, the ship has been torpedoed whilst on a convoy mission, and there's no immediate threat, let's say that the U-boat slipped away or escorts going after it, you're just left having to deal with a torpedo hit, then obviously priority would be made to send power to the pumps. Conversely, if for whatever reason, be it a hit or something else, you've lost a significant amount of your generating power whilst you're under air attack, for example, or possibly even surface attack by enemy shipping, if you happen to have electro-hydraulic turrets and other gun mounts, for the main guns that is, then obviously your main power would be directed towards your guns, your anti-aircraft guns primarily, because they're easier to power anyway if they've got RPC, but also armament as a whole, because if you're under attack by aircraft or enemy surface shipping, then your priority is to get them to stop attacking you, either by driving them off or shooting them down or sinking them. And whilst you obviously will also have a certain amount of priority power going to pumps if you've been hit and are taking on water, chances are, unless you're under massive torpedo assault by destroyers or torpedo bombers, you probably can survive somewhat longer by closing off bulkheads and so forth with the damage you're taking, as opposed to if you've taken a spread of submarine torpedoes amidships. And if you're not under attack anymore and you're not subject to major flooding, then priority power would be to things like lighting and ventilation to allow the crews to patch up whatever damage you have taken. So really, it just depends on what exact situation you're in at that point. Some random human asks, of course, as a museum ship, there's no fuel, no ammunition, stores, crew, etc., aboard, but USS Wisconsin seems to be riding rather high in the water. I'm curious, how does she compare in terms of her draft compared to her Iowa-class museum ship sisters? Now, that's a very interesting question, which prompted me to go back over the various photos I'd taken while visiting the various vessels. And you're right, there is a difference between how each ship seems to be riding in terms of her overall draft. The one that's riding closest to her design draft appears to be the Missouri, or as Ryan would say, Missouri, which, as you can see here, as of September 2022, seems to be running pretty close to having all of that black paint submerged. Now compare that to New Jersey, and of course you can see she is riding slightly higher than Missouri, but not by a huge amount. You know, most of what's above the waterline at this point is still battleship grey, as opposed to that relatively thin stripe of black paint, but she is a little bit further out of the water than Missouri. And then you have Wisconsin, which appears to be riding considerably higher in the water, but also interestingly USS Iowa, which, as you can see here, is riding out of the water apparently to a similar degree to Wisconsin. Now, initially I was looking for a connection, and I thought, well, hang on a minute. Iowa and Wisconsin were decommissioned and taken into museum ship service later. Missouri and New Jersey were the earlier two, so perhaps that's the connection. Perhaps the Navy stripped more stuff out of Iowa and Wisconsin than they did out of New Jersey and Missouri. And for a moment, I was going to give that as an answer. However, I then took a slightly closer look and I noticed something interesting, which I think may actually be closer to the accurate answer. I think the whole thing's an optical illusion. Now, it may well actually be because the Iowa and the Wisconsin were the last to decommission, but not because of them being stripped out. I think they were just given a different paint job while they were in reserve, while their two sisters had gone off to be museum ships. And the reason for that is, look at the bow. Okay, so this is Wisconsin. Now, notice where the black paint starts relative to the curve of the bow. So you've got a very extended, almost clipper-style bow, and then it curves back, and then it curves down to an almost straight stem, and then obviously that extends down to the bulbous bow underwater. Now, you'll notice that proportionally speaking, this black paint line starts almost as soon as the stem has straightened out. Now I'm going to show you a comparison of all the four photos we've just had, looking just at their bows. So going clockwise from the top left, you've got New Jersey, Missouri, Iowa, and Wisconsin. Now, notice how on the first two ships, that's New Jersey and Missouri, there is a long stretch of stem before the black paint starts, whereas on both Iowa and Wisconsin, there's actually relatively little. In fact, on Iowa, there's almost none. If you were to transpose where that black paint line starts from Wisconsin or Iowa onto New Jersey or Missouri, suddenly they actually all look fairly similar. Now, granted, when you look at these and measure the proportions, there is a very slight variation in exactly how high each ship is riding, But that is, within a foot or two for all of them, not the rather significant difference that would be suggested by the paint schemes as they've been done. So, as I said, I suspect that whilst they were in reserve after their two other sister ships had gone off to be museum ships, Iowa and Wisconsin received a paint job wherein that black paint was actually painted a lot higher than it had been on New Jersey and Missouri. And in fact, it looks even like there may even be a difference in the height of that line between New Jersey and Missouri, just between themselves. And so it gives a slightly deceptive look to how high each ship is riding. And in fact, they're all pretty similar. Although, if you happen to live near one of these museum ships and you happen to own a very long tape measure and you can get the agreement of the museum ship staff, then you could always go up to the bow and run a long tape measure reel down to see exactly how high above the water you are, and then we can collate everybody's reports and work out which one is riding slightly higher by the bow compared to all the others. Prussian Hill asks, it seems to me that most Confederate ironclads were improvised, having either been fashioned together with whatever iron was available on whatever hulls were easily taken over or constructed rapidly. Assuming for the sake of argument the Confederates were successful in their aspirations for independence, how long do you see the Confederate ironclads lasting in service in the post-war Confederate Navy? Would some builds or designs last longer than others? And do you think it's telling that the US Navy never seemed to maintain former Confederate Navy ironclads in post-war service? For that last bit, I don't think there's a huge amount to be drawn from the fact the US Navy didn't maintain the former Confederate monitors in the post-war service, or ironclads if you like. The US Navy didn't maintain many active monitors or ironclads at all. The vast majority of the Union monitors went into reserve, and most of them never saw active frontline service again. And the other thing is, of course, that only a handful of Confederate ironclads even survived the American Civil War. So the few that were actually in possession of the US Navy, well, at a time when they're decommissioning the vast majority of their own monitor fleet, which at least has the advantage of being built in mostly homogeneous classes, a very, very small handful of essentially unique scratch-built ironclads really doesn't rate very highly on the to be preserved in reserve fleet status. But if we assume that somehow the Confederate States won their independence, and therefore the campaigns that saw an awful lot of Confederate ironclads burned because the Confederate forces were retreating away from the rivers they were on, obviously weren't burnt, then, yeah, again, a lot of the issues I just mentioned would come back to haunt the Confederate Navy in a post-war environment as well. Almost all of the Confederate ironclads were built to unique plans with whatever materials, guns, engines, etc. they could scrape together at the time, which is going to make post-war maintenance of a fleet that essentially has individual maintenance requirements something of a nightmare. Some of them are very, very rush jobs, others are slightly better thought out. I think the ones that they were building towards the end, like the Texas and the Virginia II, etc., they probably would stick around for a while because they're a little bit better thought out than some of the earlier experimental ones. But I don't think many, if any, would last too long. They would have to keep some of the better ones, in terms of size and armament, around in the immediate aftermath just to guard against the Union Navy, because obviously if you completely disarm your Navy, that's an invitation for round two to start up. But I think the vast majority of Confederate ironclads would have been very rapidly decommissioned and pulled apart for their armament and materials, and then as trade started up again, rather than go with sort of slatted iron and multi-layered iron armor, one of the first things the Confederates would have probably done once their economy began to show some signs of recovery would have been to trade materials, not obviously like ironclad building materials, but just general trade goods, with Europe in exchange for both thicker slab iron armor and also potentially the technology to manufacture it themselves. and then gone on to build a small force of ironclads with considerably better protection and more uniform firepower and propulsion systems based on the lessons of the war. Christian B asks, when steam-powered ships received coal in a foreign harbour, for example the 2nd Pacific Squadron in Spain, how do they pay for that coal? Did they carry massive amounts of gold aboard for such an occasion? In theory, coal could be purchased by the ship's captain using the funds available on the ship, but most of the funds available on a ship were for paying the crew, so that would be an in extremis circumstance only. Usually, if we're talking about fairly large movements of ships, or if we're talking about a known route, say a ship on patrol, then the government that owns that ship or fleet would arrange in advance for coal to be purchased through agents in the port, or messages could be sent by the time you got to the age of the telegraph at least, and then later the radio, to let people know ahead of time, hey, I'm going to be in so-and-so port and I'm going to need X amount of coal. And so, either the ambassador or most usually the naval attachés in various ports would find coal that was available for sale from a supplier, and it would be purchased ahead of time, and then the ships would resupply. If coal wasn't available in a specific port, then they could also hire colliers, which would collect coal from a port where it was available, and then that collier would go to that port. So it would be done essentially by the government-admiralty on behalf of the ship's captain. And then as a kind of intermediary step between a government organising something and the captain physically having to pay money over, they could also issue promissory notes if necessary, because, well, they're pretty much usually going to be honoured, considering warship status as a piece of floating sovereign territory, providing, of course, that the captain negotiates something approximating a reasonable rate. But the most usual process was for it to be bought in advance by official government envoys. And that is one of the slightly subtler ways in which a large and powerful country could actually exert control over the activities of a smaller country it was at war with, because if they had money to burn and you knew roughly where an enemy warship was going to go and try and refuel, this is something the British did on several occasions, you could just buy up all the coal, or later on oil, in a particular port. And if you'd bought it all up, well, that had been sold to you, it belonged to you, it couldn't be sold to the enemy warship that's shown up, even in a neutral port. And so there might be several thousand tons of coal or several 100,000 gallons of oil sitting there, but since it now belonged to the British Empire, you couldn't have it. And on top of that, you could also use those kinds of purchases as a form of psychological warfare or misinformation. So when Graf Spee put in South America, this being the World War II Graf Spee, the British bought up a ton of oil in the immediately adjacent ports just over the border to give the impression that Renown and Ark Royal were about to show up and obviously needed refueling, because why else would you spend a large amounts of money on buying up several 100,000 gallons of oil? And that worked in part, along with other measures, to deceive both Captain Langsdorff and German High Command into thinking that Renown and Ark Royal were actually relatively close by, when in fact they were almost a week away. Daniel asks, how effective were blockade runners for the Axis and Central Powers? Large convoys were obviously effective for supplying the Allies and the Entente, but could a single ship carrying supplies or raw materials make a big difference for the war effort? The risk-reward seems to plummet between 1915 to 1945, with a huge leap in airborne reconnaissance and upscale growth of economies and manufacturing. In both wars, the blockade runners that the Axis or Central Powers used started off with a certain degree of effectiveness, but very rapidly this began to drop off as the Allies or the Entente began to step up anti-blockade runner efforts. And it was a fairly risky proposition from the beginning, because in both cases the Royal Navy imposed a blockade, but obviously as that blockade tightened, it got more and more dangerous, hence why the Germans in World War I invested in cargo submarines like this one you can see here, and in the Second World War attempted to use various submarines for high-value transits as well. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that in World War II, it was slightly easier for a German blockade runner program to work because they had the entire East Coast, Atlantic coast, not East Coast, there isn't really a French East Coast, the entire Atlantic west coast of France to work with when it came to sending out blockade runners. Initially, obviously, they had the northern bit, and then once they took over Vichy France, they had the whole coast, and that was a lot easier to launch from than trying to get through the Channel or around Scotland. But almost simultaneously with that, the Allies established more and more air supremacy, which tended to shut things down. However, you couldn't really do blockade running regularly with large numbers of vessels, so that ruled out bulk cargoes, and especially if you're using submarines which have very limited cargo space, or even the relatively limited stock of fast cargo vessels which occasionally tried to make the runs to and from other places. The other main controlling factor was, where are you going to get goods? So in the early part of World War I, in fact for a good chunk of World War I, and theoretically even for a very, very early part of World War II, you could trade, if you were Germany, with the United States, but that window got shut off at various points in the two conflicts, and so their only real choice was to trade essentially with the Japanese, because the British, and then in both wars later on the Americans, were kind of leaning on neutral powers to not really so much trade with the Germans. But the other fact was that the supplies that the Germans needed were only available in very specific places. So for a lot of the neutral powers, it didn't matter so much because Germany wasn't looking to trade with them anyway. Because if you can only bring a small amount of goods back, then those have to be some very high value, low volume goods, which can significantly impact the war effort disproportionate to their actual size. So, for example, if you look at the US Navy's report on commodities believed to have been shipped from the Far East to Europe by submarine in 1942 and 44, the single largest amount of material supplied was 250 tons of tungsten, of which at least 50 tons was sunk, and so somewhere between 80 and 200 tons made it through. There was also molybdenum, of which 40 tons was sent through. Tin, gold, rubber, that's something that's common across both World War I and World War II, as well as some Japanese electronics, quinine, opium, various plans and weather maps, and rather interestingly, 3 aerial torpedoes, because German aerial torpedoes weren't really up to all that much a lot of the time. And all of these were goods, as I said, that could have a disproportionate impact. So rubber obviously was needed for things like seals, and that might make up a very small portion of an overall mechanism, but a very critical one. Tin, mainly electronics, but also some alloying. Molybdenum and tungsten were both in incredibly high demand as alloying materials, molybdenum particularly for steel. Tungsten, various uses, some in jet engines for the Germans, tank rounds and various other things. But essentially what you were looking at was materials which the Germans couldn't source in the territory that they held, and which you would then alloy or use as a critical part of a much larger mechanism or projectile to make it significantly more effective. As a rubber on both world wars was a particularly favoured commodity, although synthetic rubber was beginning to be produced in Germany towards the end of World War II, as far as I recall. So yeah, a single ship that managed to bring in a large quantity of these kinds of materials could make a fairly big difference to the war effort. Again, I'm not a land-based historian, but I recall reading somewhere that late World War II German tank projectiles had some issues with the fact that the armour-penetrating rounds were being made purely out of steel and therefore were less effective than, say, a tungsten-tipped armor penetrating round. Now, that would make sense. As I said, those of you who have studied the land war can inform me as to the precise veracity of that statement below. But assuming that that is the case, which I say it makes a certain degree of engineering sense, if you look at just even the stuff that's shipped by submarine, if 80 tons of tungsten got through, and let's assume it was only used for armor-piercing tank shells as opposed to anything else, well, 80 tons, that's 80,000 kilos. Even if you used 10 kilos in each tank shell, and you wouldn't because you maybe even use 1 kilo, but even if you used 10 kilos, that's 8,000 much more effective tank rounds, and obviously 80,000 much more effective tank rounds if you used 1 kilo. Tungsten's a fairly dense material. 80 tons of tungsten doesn't actually take up that much space. So it's these kinds of high value, low bulk items that you'd need. And yeah, if the blockade runners had been fairly successful, that could have had a fairly significant effect on the war effort. Not enough to win the war for Germany, but certainly enough to massively increase Allied losses. But as we said, the efforts kind of petered out as both wars went on. Donovan Lawler asks, we know that just about all the signatories violated or at least bent the treaties in some way. In your opinion, who was the most blatantly obvious and who was the most subtle about it? It runs across a complete spectrum, I think. If you're going to go for most blatant of the people who actually directly signed up to the treaties, I think most blatant has to be the Japanese. The Italians, when it comes to, we're talking specifically cruiser design, the Italians did violate the treaty quite significantly as well, but they were a lot better about concealing it, to the point that everyone sort of believed the Italians were sticking to the limits until one of their cruisers ended up in Gibraltar Drydock, and dimensions were taken, and the Allies went, well, the British at that point just went, yeah, no, that ship does not weigh 10,000 tons. Whereas with the Megamis, the Japanese, they were doing layers on layers. They were hiding the fact that Megamis could be turned into heavy cruisers, but they were also blatantly lying about their actual displacement, to the point that, when they said, oh yeah, well, we've built these 10,000 ton ships that have 15 6-inch guns, and they've got a bunch of torpedoes, and they're really fast, and they've also got a degree of armor. And that led to the famous quote when the director of naval construction back in the Royal Navy got hold of the claimed figures. So this is what the Japanese were saying loud and proud. Yeah, this is what our ship can do. He just looked at that, ran the calculations quickly, and went, there is no way the Japanese are telling the truth. He said either they've made their ships out of cardboard or they're lying. And it turned out to be actually a little bit of both, given the Tomazuru incident and the Fourth Fleet incident. I think subtlety has to kind of go two ways. Partly to the US Navy for the Lexingtons, and partly to the British, as many of you will be aware, in my opinion, for the County class. The British, I think, generally were the most subtle, because they tended to either make sure that the regulations were written in very, very specific ways that happened to benefit their design ideas, like with the Nelsons, or they pioneered the fitted for but not with, which, as I said, I've mentioned before, I massively suspect that the Counties were designed for but not with full-length belt armour. And so they could say, hand on heart, yes, our heavy cruisers, the County class, they are absolutely within the 10,000 ton limits. And yes, they were. You could put them on a giant set of scales if you wanted, and they would weigh less than 10,000 tons. The fact that you could very quickly refit them to be more than 10,000 tons and more capable, and not suffer substantially as a result, that is an entirely separate matter, and please don't look too carefully at our design drawings. Whereas with the Americans, they kind of did a wink-wink, nudge-nudge subtle kind of cheating with the Lexingtons, because they said, right, well, we've agreed to this displacement for carriers, but the conversions are going to come out a bit heavier than that, so we're going to carve out an exception for us, and I suppose the Japanese as well, for two much heavier carriers. And then they looked back at their designs and went, yeah, that's not going to fit even in that bit we've negotiated. So we're going to creatively interpret the upgrades and refits clause that allows us for another 3,000 tons, and we're going to declare that. So, we're going to tell everyone, yes, look, we are kind of slightly twisting that, but, we are acknowledging our carriers are a little bit over the displacement. So people sort of looked at it and went, well, that's not technically within the spirit of what that clause was for, but fair enough, you are telling us that you have a couple of slightly overweight carriers, let's go with that, and it seems reasonable. Of course, the Lexingtons were even over the declared weight, so they got away with it. So, I guess that's refuge in audacity. You tell everyone that you are kind of cheating, but you're declaring it, and then everyone believes you, which allows you to get away with actually even more cheating. Flying Finn 1956 asks, has any historian written about Admiral Mitscher's part in taking the Japanese Navy's carrier bait during the Battle of Leyte Gulf? Should he share some blame for leaving the landing force undefended, along with Admiral Halsey? Well, from what I understand from reading through the Battle of Leyte Gulf, obviously Mitscher is subordinate to Halsey. If Halsey decides he's going short of insubordination like Admiral Lee, there's not a huge amount that Mitscher can do other than to say, yes, sir, how fast do you want us to go, sir? Mitscher was alerted by some of his staff officers that the heading north may well be a mistake. For pretty much the same reasons that Admiral Lee and his staff had concluded it was a mistake. However, Mitscher, I think, was well aware of Halsey's temperament and the fact he probably wouldn't listen to anybody. So after having established that Halsey did in fact have the same information available to hand, there wasn't a huge amount more that he could do at that stage. If either Halsey and his staff didn't come to the same conclusions, or if Halsey's staff did and Halsey still didn't want to listen even to them, there's not a huge amount he can do. So I don't think Mitscher really shares too much blame for leaving the landing force undefended. He certainly didn't, egg Halsey on and say, yes, we definitely must go forth and destroy the Japanese carrier groups. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, the Americans evolved to using the side-by-side method of resupply early in their involvement in World War II, having switched over from the towed-by-the-tanker approach. The British used the latter method, for most of the war. How did the Japanese and Germans approach resupply at sea, especially underway replenishment? For the Japanese, they actually had a surprisingly well-developed system of underway replenishment. They started off using the same method that the British used, the over-the-stern method, but they came to the conclusion that side-by-side method was actually much more preferable, similar to the way that the US did. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the US and the Japanese, operating on opposite sides of the Pacific and therefore looking at extremely long ranges, were the two that advanced the nature of underway replenishment the quickest. For the Japanese, however, they were relatively quickly knocked back in terms of their capability to conduct underway replenishment by two factors. Firstly, the US Navy went after Japanese oilers and tankers with as much gusto as the Japanese went after the American ones, except the Americans tended to be a little bit more successful as time went on, and that meant that there were just physically fewer ships for them to resupply from. And of course, as the war shifted, the war started getting closer and closer and closer to the Japanese home islands, which made underway replenishment at sea somewhat less necessary because the war was coming to them. With the Germans, the German approach was a little bit different. They didn't really have a fleet as such with which there was any need for underway replenishment, and most of the missions that they undertook, as far as their battle fleet was concerned at least, didn't really need it either. Where they did do replenishment at sea, which was tended to be U-boats and Hilfskreuzer for the most part, although occasionally the odd warship grade raider as well, that tended to be a relatively crude method, which was simply coming as close alongside to the resupply ship as humanly possible. So a kind of side-by-side method, but whereas the Japanese, the Americans, and then obviously later on the British would do underway replenishment at a reasonable speed, most of the German replenishment efforts tended to be either, well, not quite stationary, but either near as close to stationary as makes no difference, or very low speed efforts, just enough to maintain steerage. And that's partly influenced by the fact, well, it wasn't a fleet with any particular hurry to go anywhere. It was just a case of meeting up between supply ships and U-boats and a Hilfskreuzer in very, very remote distant parts of the sea, or possibly even in anchorages, and just restocking at leisure, at which point you could afford to get an awful lot closer in side by side, pretty much alongside each other, as opposed to full underway replenishment where you have to maintain a certain amount of distance unless you really want to get bashed together a lot. Alternate historian Turtle Duck asks, from my current understanding, casemate guns on warships were replaced with dual-purpose guns to save weight. If the Washington Naval Treaty was never signed, would the casemate guns have remained a feature on warships with smaller quick-firing guns being used for anti-aircraft defense? Not quite. Towards the end of the 1910s, and certainly into the early 1920s, for capital ships, there was a recognition that casemate guns were pretty much on their way out anyway. As ship speeds had improved, casemates had been washed out more and more and more. As a total, although you could get a lot of guns on casemates, their individual arcs of fire were relatively limited, as was their elevation, which was becoming more of an issue. And so in most of the early 1920s designs, navies were moving over to turreted weapons for their secondary battery, even though they weren't dual purpose. So that's why HMS Nelson is gracing your page at the moment, because obviously you can see there she has her twin 6-inch turrets aft as a secondary battery. And this was common across quite a few different designs. And then when you look at the sketch designs that the Royal Navy, US Navy, Japanese Navy, and even to a certain extent the French and Italian navies came up with during the battleship building holiday, the initial 10-year one, you'll see that most of the time they were also looking at their secondary batteries being now in turrets or open mounts on the upper deck rather than in armoured casemates. And as the battleship holiday looked like it was drawing to a close, so for example with the 16A design for the Royal Navy, they're by and large using turreted secondary batteries, although again they're still not dual purpose. So if the Washington Naval Treaty wasn't signed and battleship building continued, there would have been a few legacy designs from the early 1920s that still had casemate guns, but you would have been looking at turreted guns for the secondary batteries in subsequent warships. Now, of course, that does lead to a rather interesting conundrum because there is a limited amount of deck space going on, which is one of the reasons why secondaries went over to dual purpose. So some of these ships that had single-purpose turreted secondaries would, once anti-aircraft guns became much, much more important, actually find themselves with relatively limited space to put additional heavy anti-aircraft guns that, large enough to be considered dual purpose. They would therefore have had to have been modernized quite extensively, and in some ways that would actually prove something of a benefit, because if you've got, well, like say with the Nelsons, big, heavy, armoured twin 6-inch gun turrets, then if you replace them with a larger number of, in the Royal Navy's case, 4.5 or 5.25-inch dual-purpose mounts, you've actually got some weight savings to be made by removing the heavy 6-inch guns and their turrets, and obviously that, therefore, it'll have less of an impact on the ship's overall displacement and stability, as opposed to ripping out casemate guns, which are lower in the ship and have less effect on stability in the first place, and tend to weigh a little bit less per gun, at least, than turreted weapons. And finally for this week, Bob Loblaw asks, was there any special formula for warship hulls and strengths to combat heavy weather situations over and above what cargo ships might use? I think a heavily armoured ship might see some differences, or would it be naturally assumed that a warship is tougher than a merchant ship? It's not so much a formula, but more general design principles, some of which just derive from other factors, and some of which are specifically connected to durability in heavy seas. Firstly, of course, most frontline warships are going to be going a lot faster than the vast majority of merchant vessels, with the exception of a few things like liners and so forth. And that means that even in non-storm conditions, the forces exerted on warship hulls, going 28, 30 knots, are going to be considerably greater than those exerted on a tramp steamer tootling around at 12 knots. And you have to design your hull strength for that. Then, of course, you have the fact that warships are designed to take damage. You don't want them to, but ultimately they probably are going to. And so you have massive amounts of compartmentalization, which increases the overall structural strength of a ship. You also will tend to have thicker hull plating, because the hull plating ideally, not in all cases, but ideally should also be acting as a form of splinter protection. And you expect these ships to be lasting longer and to be out there a lot more without needing refits and repairs. A merchant ship can do fairly steady runs of, a few weeks at a time. And then if it needs repairs, it can be expected to go in for repairs and, patch a little bit of the hull plating, so on and so forth. Whereas a warship might be expected to operate for years and years and years at a time with an uncertain point of return to the dockyard. So between the splinter damage and the need for durability, the hull plating, as I said, tends to be a bit thicker. The framing tends to be a bit closer together. And of course, merchant ships have pulls in the opposite direction, where if you're a tanker, you need big open voids to store oil or whatever other liquids you're transporting. And even bulk cargo carriers tend to want big open holds for grain or boxes, etc., etc. And obviously a big open space makes a ship more vulnerable to damage in rough weather than many, many enclosed spaces, which most warships will have. There are other factors as well, like the general hull form of a ship that goes fast with its length to beam ratio versus the hull form of a ship that's expected to go a lot slower but maximize cargo carrying space, and its length to beam ratio and its general cross-section will also have a certain amount of influence on the overall strength of the entire vessel. But yeah, it's not so much a particular formula, it's just more of the fact that warships tend to be much more heavily built and much more compartmentalized, which in turn makes them much better able to stand up to heavy weather and other high-stress situations than your average merchant ship. And that's it for this week. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. There are some very tentative plans for an overseas trip in February, but more details will be coming up in Drydocks further down through the month. I will try and keep you informed as best I can as those plans develop. But other than that, thanks very much, everyone, and see you in another video.